Hello and welcome to the Apologetics 315 podcast with your hosts Brian Auten and Chad Gross. Join us for conversations and interviews on the topics of apologetics, evangelism, and the Christian worldview.
Nice going, boys. You're playing yesterday's tape.
Hello and welcome to the podcast. This is Brian Auten.
And I'm Chad Gross.
Okay, Chad, we've got a returning guest today, Travis Dickinson. We did interview him on Logic in the Way of Jesus, and we'll link to that in the show notes. But what are we talking about today, Chad?
Today we're going to be talking about the argument from reason. In Travis's book, Logic in the Way of Jesus, he has a chapter on this argument. I've always found it to be a very interesting argument, and it's often unutilized. And I really like the formation that he makes of the argument in his book. And so we asked him to come back and unpack it for us. And so we're actually going to take it step by step and work through the argument. And we're also going to talk about what does the argument from reason say about God, and what does the argument from reason tell us about Jesus?
Yeah, it's going to be good. Let's go to this interview with Travis Dickinson.
Let's get ready. Switch me on.
Well, Travis Dickinson, thanks for coming back on the podcast.
It's my pleasure, guys. Good to see you.
Well, it's been a little while. What's new in your area of the woods?
Well, not a whole lot in terms professionally, just continuing to promote recent work and that kind of thing. But at home, it's our daughter's about to graduate from high school. So,
that's exciting.
We're on all systems go of getting her ready to, ship out. So, I mean, she's just going to my school, so it's just down the street. But
right,
still,
well, congrats to her.
Yes.
That's great. We wanted to have you on today because we did a great interview with you on your book, Logic in the Way of Jesus. And in there, you have a chapter on the argument from reason. And we were hoping to take a closer look at that argument. And so before we start doing that, can you give us an overview of the argument?
Absolutely. Yeah. So it's one of my favorites. And really, in working on the book, it's become even more so because it, clear to me how powerful it really is. Stated formally, I've got it as, if God does not exist, then either logical principles do not exist, or they exist as brute abstract objects. It's not the case that logical principles do not exist because this would be self-defeating. Premise 3, it's not the case that they exist as brute abstract objects, since that would be ad hoc. Therefore, God exists. So let me sort of give the gist of that now. So what I'm trying to do is say there are logical principles. There are these real things in reality. Call those the logical principles that govern thought, govern our reasoning. And then we have to think worldviewishly. So we have to understand, we sort of have to locate them on our worldviews. If one were to deny the existence of God, by far the most common option is to be a naturalist and just deny anything outside the natural physical world. And so that seems to be a view that would deny logical principles themselves. And I'm saying that that's self-defeating, and I hope we unpack all these things. Or you can say that they do exist, but they just exist separate from the existence of God. There is no God on this sort of more Platonist view, but I think that that's ad hoc. So either way, we kind of are led back to the existence of God. So now let's hopefully break that down.
Right. I was gonna say, for listeners who are already thinking, "Whoa, that was a lot." What
did I get into? Yeah,
we are going to take that premise by premise, and and Travis is going to unpack that for us.
Yeah. So I mean, the gist of it is that I think if you deny God's existence, it's very difficult, not impossible, but it's very difficult to locate logical principles themselves. And then, of course, that has huge implications for the use of logic as we think about our worldviews and evaluate our worldviews.
Could I see if I could try to break it down for the layman slightly? So coming at it, because we came at it right with the premises, and sometimes if you're hearing it, reading it's great. If you're hearing it, can be challenging, depending on the type of learner or listener you are.
Absolutely.
So I kind of see it like this. Correct me or guide me if I'm getting it wrong. But we look at the world and we see things like design, and we say, well, what accounts for that? And we have a few options on the table, and we eliminate ones that don't seem to account for it well enough, and we're left with what seems to be the best explanation.
Yeah.
And in this case, we're looking at reason as the thing that we observe in the world, in our own lives. We use it. We can't get away from it. It undergirds even our thinking about it. And so we have to say, what explains that? Could it be naturalism? Does that give us the resources to explain it? Or is it Platonism? These things that just, it's a brute fact. Well, these things both fail. Therefore, it must be God, because that's the other option. So is that sort of the way to put it for the layman?
I think that's right. Like, when we try to explain what a logical principle is, the most, in a way, the argument is saying the most plausible explanation is the mind of God. In some way that logical principles are grounded in the mind of God. I mean, after all, we're talking about reason. We're talking about things that seem to be somehow related to minds, right? It's hard to see what reason means if a mind isn't involved. And so if there are genuine logical principles that genuinely, are the standards that we appeal to as we evaluate our reasons, then we have to explain them somehow. And the divine mind, I'm suggesting, is, I mean, not even just a suggestion, but I think is just the very most plausible way. I struggle to take the other options all that seriously, even though, I think there's some appeal, but it's hard to see how you explain logic at all. And that's a really powerful argument for God's existence then. If there's literally no good way, no plausible way to explain this fact of reality, and good luck denying that fact, right? Doing it reasonably, at least. And that leads us straight to the mind of God. Like, man, what a powerful argument.
So we won't go down any of these other rabbit trails that I'm going to ask you about here. But I'm
going to bring them up anyway.
Tempt me
I would just want
right.
maybe the listeners to get a context of, what we're talking about today and unpacking is one argument from reason. But it's a family of arguments
absolutely
about that. And so who would be some of the other proponents have made their own versions or own ways of arguing from reason? Who would be the proponents, and what directions maybe they've taken? Without going too far down those paths,
Sure. So C.S. Lewis is probably the most famous, do we call him a historical figure? I mean, I think at this point he's a historical figure. Right. And it's not to say that there aren't people talking about it. Lewis definitely has some of his unique contributions, but there's a lot of Lewis that's really just being talked about. He just put it in such a powerful way oftentimes, and with sort of a creative twist even at times. So he gets sort of given credit for that reason, which I think is well-deserved. So Lewis is definitely one who is bringing it up. He doesn't, characteristic of Lewis, this is true of the moral argument and some other arguments, the argument from desire and some of the other ones that he's sort of famous for popularizing. Lewis almost never gives a robust, sort of rigorous expression of these arguments. He kind of just puts it out there in a real kind of easy way to hear it and powerful way. Sort of drops that bomb and walks away. And so when you try to work it out, there's a number of different directions you can go. And, I don't know if Lewis, had in mind a particular direction, but somebody like Alvin Plantinga would be somebody who has definitely explored this argument in his evolutionary argument against naturalism. Definitely has parts to that would be very reminiscent of an argument from reason. Here, my emphasis is on the existence of the logical principles themselves, which is a little different than some others, because I'm in a way doing metaphysics or world, kind of coming at it from a metaphysical look at it to say, what is the logical principle? And again, like, you're faced with the terrible option, I think, if you eschew the existence of God, you either have to say, well, they just exist in Plato's heaven, or they don't exist at all. And that's no good choice. Those are not good options, it seems to me.
So before we start unpacking the premises, what actually kind of got you interested in this argument? What attracts you to it?
Yeah. So I was doing work on the book, where the book is, more broadly, the project is to kind of I mean, it's a logic textbook, but it's trying to be more than that, of course, is sort of trying to frame logic for a Christian in a way, and talking about the ways in which logic is relevant to us, which should be obvious enough. It shouldn't be that we need a book for it, but we do. And so in just trying to, map out ideas of like, how does logic relate to the Christian? Logic, reason, critical thinking, how does it relate to the Christian? It was just clear to me that like, man, what a cool part to it that not only should we embrace as Christians principles of critical thinking and careful reflection on these things and using them to bring, sort of evaluate our worldviews and our Christian faith and, all these things that, again, like are part of the book and trying to argue for all these things. But not only should we do all those things, we can actually give a kind of metaphysics of logic, a ground of logic that if you don't have that, I mean, that does sound a little funny. That's why, it's worth kind of sitting with these ideas, having a ground of logic. Some people would say, isn't logic the ground? But there's reasons to think that no, actually, that God ultimately is that sort of ultimate metaphysic, the ultimate ground. And so it was just kind of like this really neat thing that, okay, that's got to be part of this picture, part of this project, because, right, it gives this full view, this full sort of exploration of how to think of logic and how to relate it to the life of the Christian. So ultimately, it comes from that idea for me in writing the book was to say, what does it mean to love God with all of our minds? Well, here we go. Let's explore the nuts and bolts of that. And this is definitely part of that picture.
Yeah, I definitely see how that's foundational to account for reason itself if we're talking about loving God with all our mind.
Right.
Yeah. So let's take a look at the argument, and just for the sake of the listener, I'll go through premise by premise.
Okay.
So premise one says, if God does not exist, then either logical principles do not exist, which would be naturalism, or they exist as brute abstract objects. So let's talk about those options. So can you unpack what you mean by naturalism and Platonism for our listeners?
Yes. So naturalism, it's of course a view that gets worked out in a number of different ways, but and I always, want to be careful with that because, of course, not every naturalist is the same as every other naturalist. But
and you get the old "not my naturalism."
Yeah, right, right. Which sometimes fair enough.
Right. Yeah.
And so here I'm understanding naturalism as kind of just at face value saying all that exists is the natural world and objects of the natural world. Right. So close cousins of naturalism would be views like materialism and physicalism, where the materialist says that only the material world exists, or physicalism says only physical things exist, and so on. So like they're not necessarily identical views, but they tend to go in groups. And of course, atheism sort of can be tacked onto all this. So usually it means that ultimately all that exists is the natural world of physical material objects, and that's it. On that view, it seems to me one has to deny the real existence of logical principles, because logical principles, whatever they are, they're not natural, physical, material, it seems to me.
Right.
And sometimes people will say, well, why couldn't it just be the property of, say, human brain when we process or reason in some way or other? The problem is because that's what it's assessing. It's assessing the human brain. It's assessing our processing and so on. Right? It's those standards. So think of it this way. It's sort of like if our brain is not functioning well, if we're not reasoning well, if that's all we are, our brains, right, on this view, then what logic does is evaluates that to say there's a problem and something has to be reassessed. It seems like it'd have to be outside of, for it to be this objective. Again, I'm really emphasizing the word real here, real and genuine. you don't have a real and genuine sort of logical principle or logical standard if it's the property of the very thing that you're aiming to evaluate. And so if we can evaluate rational thought, then it seems like these have to exist outside of the human brain or mind. And again, if you think about a logical principle, whatever it is, you're not going to stumble on it in the woods or something, right? You're not going to find it in the laboratory. It's not a natural physical thing. And in the book, I think, as I describe it, in trying to give the properties of a logical principle, right, to describe it in some way, it's the kind of thing that doesn't seem to come into existence at any time, right? A contradiction is a contradiction is a contradiction and has been eternally. So it's this eternal truth. It is a normative fact, meaning that it tells us how one ought to reason, right? It's non-physical, non-natural. It's really just in the category of the things that the naturalist denies, it seems to me. And so we're kind of left with, for the naturalist, faced with having to say, bite the bullet, as naturalist has to with anything non-natural. I mean, that's just what it is to be a naturalist in a way, and say that logic doesn't exist. Now, they can do that and do, in fact, do that. Many naturalists, somebody like Michael Ruse, for example, is very vocal about denying the existence of something like moral facts. Why does the naturalist deny moral facts, like genuine moral facts? Because they just don't fit in the natural category. They are non-natural things if they exist at all. And so as a naturalist, he's forced to say, there's just no such thing as a moral fact. Now, I think that's scary. I think that's worrisome. I'm not going to, I'm going to hold my wallet a little close when I'm with, not letting them babysit my kids and so on. Like if you really honestly don't think moral facts exist, I'm definitely worried about that. But there isn't, I think there's a worse problem, right? I think you can deny moral facts, and it's scary. It's super implausible and worrisome for, kind of society, but that is a philosophically consistent view. Mm-hmm. But notice if you deny logical principles, you have cut the legs out of your own view.
Yes.
Because you cannot, while you can deny moral facts and logically argue for your view, you cannot deny logical facts and logically argue for that view. Right. And if you do, you're just being inconsistent, at least. It's not a consistent view. And that's why I say it's self-defeating if one denies the real existence of logical facts.
Now, so what about Platonism?
Okay. So Platonism, right? Mm-hmm. So Platonism is, now in this context, Platonism, of course, means a lot of different things too, through history. We don't so much mean literally Plato's view here, at least not the full package of Plato's view. But what we're talking about is this idea that there is the natural sort of material physical world. And then there is what's sometimes referred to as Plato's heaven, or the world of the forms, or whatever, where there are these, world of abstract, so-called abstract objects that exist. So that would be like the world of the forms again. So things like, right, in the material world, you have beautiful things, beautiful objects. In the world of the forms, you have beauty itself. The way it would work is to say, you might want to say that there are these other non-natural things like moral facts, or like something like even mathematical facts would exist for the Platonists, would exist outside space and time, outside the material, physical, natural world. And so the Platonists could say, this is what the world is like. We have the world as experienced, and then we have the world of forms. And in the world of the forms, we've got mathematical facts, moral facts, and say logical facts. And there you go. You're not denying logical facts, so your view isn't straightforwardly self-defeating. That's, nice.
That's a bonus.
You don't want your view to be self-defeating. You don't want to cut the legs out of your own view, if at all possible. The problem here, though, is that, and let me just say this too, that if I were an atheist, I'd be a Platonist. I don't think I could come to the place of accepting and embracing naturalism in that strict sense that I described it, because you're just denying too much. And it seems obvious to me that logical facts exist, right? The world is that way. I think we are directly acquainted with the existence of logical facts. I can say more about that if you want. I think that we have an intuitive grasp of these things where I really don't take seriously the view that there are no such things as moral facts, as logical facts, mathematical facts, and the rest. So were I to be an atheist, I would be a Platonist.
No, I'm in agreement there with you. And I also would say that I know in the book you even allude to that. You say something, I don't remember exactly how you word it, but you say something along the lines that some atheists adopt, or non-believers, whatever you want to call them, non-theists, will adopt Platonism because naturalism gives away too much.
Yeah. Though it's the far minority view. I mean, by far. Mm-hmm. Eric Weilenberg is a great example of somebody who has defended, I think really, it's one of I always direct my students to read him if they want to look at this view of Platonism, atheistic Platonism. And he's a great source. That's thoughtful guy, really brilliant guy working on this issue, trying to make that view work. But like I say, like I'm not, I think the view that God exists, or I think by far the best explanation for something like a logical principle would be the existence of God. Again, I think it leads there quite strongly. And so the problem with going Platonism is that it will strike as quite ad hoc. Now, I don't know if that's a term that's familiar to your listeners, so let me sort of lay that out a little bit. An explanation is ad hoc when it only explains the phenomenon that you're looking to explain. Now, that might seem like, well, that doesn't sound so bad, but it's pretty easy to explain phenomena. It really is. So let's say, right, you're come home from work, you're tired, you come into your apartment and you see that the TV's missing and you have a, broken window or something. Now, think about the probably infinite number of ways, at least indefinite number of ways that you could explain that data. It could be that aliens, right?
Always goes to the aliens.
I'm not going to say it was aliens, but it was aliens.
Aliens beamed up, right? They're after TV. I don't know why. Anyway, they beamed up your TV, and maybe it's like the frequency of the beam like shattered the window. I don't know, right? But we've noticed like we've fully explained, like nothing's left unexplained. But that would be an example of an ad hoc explanation because that's all it does. It just explains the data. But that's pretty super easy to just come up. All you got to do is get a little creative and you can come up with, a whole raft of different explanations. What we want is one for which we have independent reason to think that it's true. So obviously when we walk in, see the missing TV and the broken window, we're going to immediately think, oh no, somebody broke in and, grabbed the TV. Why is that a better explanation? Because we have independent reasons to know that kind of thing happens. You might be in a, little bit of a rough neighborhood, let's say, and your neighbor got broken into, similar sort of thing. You're going to have independent reasons favoring that explanation. And so the task for the alien proponent is to give independent reason for that. But when we evaluate these things along with the other sort of theoretical virtues, we're going to see that the best explanation is somebody grabbed your TV. Now, when it comes to explaining logical principles, the Platonist does explain the data, right? If there is a, principle of non-contradiction that just hangs out there outside space and time and exists as a brute fact, that would explain the data. But what other reason, what independent reason do we have to think that the principle of non-contradiction just exists as a brute fact? And I think we just come up short. Like we don't have any other reasons. Now, notice when it comes to the explanation that God exists, we do. This is just one argument in a whole family, actually a rather large family of arguments for the existence of God, from the cosmological, teleological, ontological, moral argument, and so on. All what's beautiful about it is that it all sort of triangulates, or I don't know if that's the right word, but it all sort of comes together and is unified by this single theory, explains all this whole range of data. And the existence of the principle of non-contradiction just doesn't, of course, do that. I think one other reason too is that I think I have to think some more about this. I think this is a fruitful sort of line of evaluation here as well, is how, so let's say that the principle of non-contradiction just exists out there in Plato's heaven. How are we hooked up to it? Like, how do we use it to evaluate an argument when we find a contradiction in an argument and we say, this is no good? How do we sort of appeal to it? How do we make use of it? It's kind of a elaborate view in a way to say that we just somehow have a knowledge or an awareness of these logical principles and can bring to such an extent that we can bring those things to bear in our reasoning processes. What's especially problematic about that is that we do it all the time. Like we've been evaluating arguments since we were small kids, right? Where your parents are telling you to eat your veggies or to go to bed or something, and you're trying to find some way to say, I shouldn't have to do that or whatever. Like, you don't know the names of these things. You couldn't formulate them. You couldn't even talk about what you're appealing to, but some way in which we do have a grasp of these things. And I find that quite incredible in a way. But there's no real, that I'm aware of at least, theory of how it is we are hooked up to these brute fact principles such that we can use them in just our day-to-day life. Now, again, how about the theistic view? Well, right, I think we do have an awareness of God. I do think that, right, it's sort of a Romans 1 sort of an idea that God can be clearly seen. And I don't think that gets us all the way there, but I do think that there's this kind of awareness, this direct awareness of God that we all have. Again, we don't necessarily know it. We sometimes have to come to the realization of it. We could even deny it as atheists too. But I'm really tempted to think that we all, in some ways, have a kind of non-cognitive, non-propositional, but direct awareness of God. And it's why we have an intuitive sense of what's right and wrong. It's why we can sort of grasp the a priori truths of mathematics. It's why we can grasp the logical principles and bring those to bear on our arguments.
So just to clarify, because that is fascinating to think about. You're saying that even if we grant, and I might completely botch this, Travis, so please feel free to correct me.
Sure.
Even if we grant that there's these Platonic logical principles out there, it seems surprising that we're able to ascertain them, that our minds seem designed to use them, to evaluate things. And a more eloquent explanation would be that we're actually created in the image of the ultimate mind, which is why we're able to ascertain them and use them to evaluate.
You're right. And not just as a part of the divine image, though I think that's definitely part of the picture, but that God makes himself known to us. And I want to suggest that God makes himself known to us in a direct way, such that we all do have an awareness of God. Again, that's not exactly what Romans 1 is talking about when it talks about we can clearly see him and what has been made. And I'm sort of butchering that, but, Romans 18, 19, 20, right around there. But I think that fits into maybe a broader picture of how for example, like we do seem to have an intuitive grasp on moral facts, right? From a young age, we all seem to. Okay. So if on my view, I would locate again these moral facts in the character of God, that God is the moral exemplar, and it is because of who God is by his nature that grounds morality. But how do we know it's wrong intuitively to lie or to torture children for fun or harm someone, these moral facts? It seems that we just know it intuitively, like we seem to have an awareness. But if what we're aware of is the character of God, then sort of, in a sense, we have this direct awareness of God. We're sort of connected to him that way. He's made himself known to us that way, but it's direct. So it's not, and it's non-cognitive, non-propositional. So it's not like we automatically have these beliefs about God. You can be aware of something and deny its existence. And I think that's the state of, an atheist and an unbeliever. They're denying the existence of something that they are directly aware of.
So it seems like the naturalist, pointing down, he doesn't have anything to support the logical principles.
Right.
But the Platonic view sort of points in the right direction. It's pointing up, but to an empty heaven. But what we're saying is, no, there's no reason for there just to be this empty heaven that exists on its own. We need God in that heaven in order to ground the logical principles. That is not ad hoc, because this is already something that is on the table that is a fully orbed view with other reasons to believe that it's the case. Now, you mentioned some thoughtful thinkers such as Eric Wielenberg and how he's atheist Platonist. I wonder, from your interaction with his material and things like that, what he might say to this, or how might he, as an atheist Platonist, want to ground logical principles? He might have ways of grounding his moral ideas, but when it comes to logical principles, is that different? Does he take a different approach, or has he not interacted with that?
So what he says in the book, as I recall, is that he says that it's a tie. It's an explanatory tie. And I think, if I understand his view, he goes on to talk about something like the problem of evil, being what breaks the tie for him. So it's, you might think of it as like, he thinks that the Platonist view sort of explains it just as well as the theistic view. But when we look at the world and we see pain, suffering, and evil, that counts against the theistic view, because that's not the world that an all-good God, or the existence of an all-good and all-powerful God, would predict. And that's not again, I'm a little bit putting that on Wielenberg. I think that's right, that he holds that. That certainly wouldn't be an uncommon way to go. I've heard other atheist figures talk about science this way. They'll say, the atheistic and Christian view are essentially tied scientifically as it explains the world, but we look around and we see evil, pain, and suffering, and that's sort of the tiebreaker. When it comes to logic, though, now again, that's probably outside of what we want to get talked into here again, but the problem of evil that is. But I think, again, I just don't think it is a tie. I think that the Platonist view is ad hoc in a way that the theistic view isn't. So if we can explain the problem of evil and so on, then, for Wielenberg, it just remains a tie explanatorily. But when I look at it and when I lay it out, there are, and again, this is just the way in which explanatory reasoning works, a so-called inference to the best explanation. What we're doing is we're looking at a hypothesis and we're asking, how well does this hypothesis do? One way to ask it is, how many theoretical virtues does this hypothesis have? Theoretical virtues would be things like simplicity, right? A kind of Occam's razor form of reasoning that says all things being equal, the simpler thesis is the right one. Things like explanatory power, which would be, how much data does it explain? Is it called conservatism or something, theoretical conservatism, which says, how well does it accord with what we already know? Things like that. And we use these virtues to evaluate the views. Like I said, just kind of come back to it's being ad hoc in a way that the theistic view isn't. I think we have all kinds of reasons to think that God exists. I really do. I'm very, I talk about this all the time in my classes and so on, that when we consider just the sheer number, not that we're just counting noses here for arguments, but it is something. And then the diversity of arguments that we have for the existence of God going everywhere from, the cosmos itself in a kind of cosmological argument, or the finitude of the cosmos, or the contingency of the cosmos, right? All forms of the cosmological argument, to the teleological argument, the fine-tuning argument, the argument from beauty, the argument from consciousness, the ontological argument. I mean, these are like really different arguments, all unified, to this sort of singular thesis that God exists. And so it's sort of just saying, look, we can also explain logic. And when you have, in any kind of inference to the best explanation, if it's a scientific theory or it's like a criminal investigation thesis, right? These are definitely the arenas that IBE really figures in. If you have all kinds of reasons for thinking somebody's guilty, and you see, and it would also explain this other fact of this other thing, that's just becomes part of the picture, part of the case. Whereas, again, when it comes to the Platonist, the only reason why I see that they could posit the existence of a logical principle would just be because that explains it and they need it for their view. But that's, in a way, the very definition of being ad hoc.
So if the premises are more plausible than not, then the conclusion follows. And your conclusion is, therefore, God exists.
Yeah.
So what does the argument from reason, if successful, what does it tell us about God?
Well, I think that's an interesting question. And I think that's one of the things I do with my students is we talk through, like when you have it, when you've gone through all these arguments, you can kind of look through to see what all that they sort of describe, because, some of the arguments for God's existence in a way barely mention God,
Very true.
The way Bill Craig talks about the Kalam cosmological argument, you just get the word cause. There's a cause for the universe. And so, but again, like that's what we're doing. I take it when we do the sort of cumulative case for God's existence, we are ultimately coming down on this wide range of arguments. And so then what picture does it paint? And I think clearly, again, you have with the argument from reason, as I've put it, you have of course, logical God. You have and it's not even just logical, it's ideally logical, right? We have the sort of paradigm of a paradigmatic mind, or paradigmatically ideal mind, you might say, that is the standard. Like God's mind instantiates the standard and is thereby normative for us as we reason, about the world as we find it. And that's a pretty significant fact. Again, the way I do it when I'm doing, say, philosophy of religion, we start oftentimes with the ontological argument and go from a perfect being to the existence of God, the greatest conceivable being. And I really do think in all that we are describing at the end of the day is sort of captured by talking about God as the greatest conceivable being, the one who is truly worthy of worship. Some conception of God like Zeus, right? We can ask whether or not there's reason to believe that Zeus exists, but even if he does exist, he's not worthy of worship. He's probably is worthy of, placation or something, make sacrifice so he leaves you alone, but he's not truly worthy of worship because he falls short of the ideal. And I think, and I'm just honestly convinced as I look through scripture and as I, do the natural theology stuff and do the philosophy of religion and so on, I think it all comes together in God's being the greatest conceivable being, so that he has all perfections. And then what's interesting is then we can look at these other arguments beyond the ontological argument, and it all corroborates in a way. It all kind of comes together, because what best fits the picture for the God of the argument of reason? The greatest conceivable being in terms of logic, in terms of reasoning, in terms of his mind. And ultimately, that's why I say, that ultimately, I see apologetics as devotional, because ultimately we're brought before a God who is worthy of worship, and we got there through logic. It's pretty cool.
That's good.
I like that a lot.
Yeah, me too. Now, you make a point in the book to kind of connect the argument from reason to what the Bible reveals about Jesus. Can you unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, so Jesus in this really quite extraordinary passage, honestly, John 1 is very, very extraordinary. The prologue to the Gospel of John, where what John aims to do is a bunch of things, honestly. He aims to sort of put Jesus, I mean, you get this very high Christology out of John 1, where this is no mere mortal. This is no mere man, even. His divine status, his divine being is evident from the opening line. In the beginning, there was God, and God in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The term for word is logos, right? So we see that Jesus, and then later on, I think it's 1:14, the Word is identified as Jesus, okay? He becomes man and lives amongst us, full of grace and truth. Now, what's interesting about this is that's a Greek word that's used in philosophy at the time. You have various ones, Heraclitus and others, who see the logos as that like ultimate thing. What's so extraordinary, what John is doing is he's relating this common, technical term. It's a common technical term for the Greeks, and saying that Jesus is that. Jesus is the divine logos, right? And of course, we should notice the connection between logos and logic, and there'd be others who can talk more intelligently about that, but there's obviously a connection there that Jesus, as it turns out, is the originating logical principle of the world that orders and unifies the world with a kind of logical consistency. So I think it's Gordon Clark that puts it, I think I quote this in the book. He kind of gives a paraphrase of it to say, in the beginning was logic, and logic was with God, and logic was God. In logic was life, and the life was the light of men. He goes on to say, any translation of John 1:1 that obscures this emphasis on mind or reason is a bad translation. In the beginning, then, was logic. And I thought that's pretty great. I don't love, I'm not a big presuppositionalist, but Gordon Clark has a good point here. So the view of John 1 is that Jesus is the kind of logos, that is the logic of creation. I mean, it's an extraordinary thing. Like it's the kind of thing that, I think we're probably meant to spend the rest of our lives trying to reflect on. And, maybe we just get a start at it, with a lifetime of reflection, but, there's maybe no more profound truth than that. But that is a profound truth that Jesus is the logos. He is the
ground of being.
The ground of being, the ground of logic, right? And that's what makes, again, that's why it featured in the book as an early chapter in a way, because shouldn't that lead us to reflect? So not to over spiritualize it here, but the reason why we should study logic is because we're, in a sense, studying God. We're studying Christ, the mind of Christ, as we reflect on critical thinking and using logic. We not only are, using what is the divine mind in a way, but we're also thereby sort of living in a way that has Jesus as our exemplar, because he certainly used logic in his ministry. And just quick with the book, I was really struck in writing the book with how many times people were astonished by Jesus's logic.
Yes.
Right. It's like once you start looking for it, it's over and over and over again, where they're astonished by his miracles too, but that happens repeatedly where Jesus is teaching and people are just astonished. Or something like Matthew 22, where the religious leaders come at him with all these logical arguments, and he just has his way with them. And these are the scholars of the day, and they're sort of walking out silent, as it says. They don't dare ask him another question. Mm-hmm. So in studying logic and studying critical thinking, we are, in a way, living out that that Christian life of being a Christ follower.
Yeah, I was just looking up when you said that in Matthew 22:46. This always makes me laugh. It says, "No one was able to answer him a word, nor did anyone dare from that day on to ask him another question."
Yeah.
And of course, that was the religious leaders because he just kept politely humiliating them.
Right. I mean, these are scholars. To like shut a scholar up is quite the feat.
Right. Yeah, that's good.
So we've talked all about this argument from reason, and we've been philosophical, and it's been great. And now I'm thinking, how can we maybe melt down those philosophical nuggets into a different mold that we could use in maybe conversation? How do you think we could maybe use that practically, as far as practical apologetics, if you will?
Yeah.
Your little tool belt full of apologetic arguments.
Right.
How might this be described simply in a way to sort of point people towards Christ?
I think that, and I could be wrong, but I think that this is the one drawback of the view, is that it does get a little technical. So that this is where I think the moral argument shines maybe a little better, because I think people understand, like, yeah, why do I think it's just abhorrently wrong to torture a child for fun? Where did that come from? And now, is the parallel thing possible to say, well, why do I think it's, wrong or irrational to hold a contradiction before my mind or whatever? I think so. I think that should be able to be used, but there's a way that the moral argument kind of hits you in the gut that I don't think that this does. It sounds a little more like abstract or technical or something, maybe.
Well, at least this one's the one you can't deny.
Yes. That's what I say. If somebody's got the time and somebody's got the willingness, and let's really think about it, then again, it just has that irony too. I'm not sure if we mentioned this, but atheists really tend to revere reason and logic.
Yeah, you point that out in the book with like the reason rally and all of that. Yes,
that's right.
Sorry to interrupt.
I think to their credit, they do. I really appreciate that about atheist friends of mine, that they're, especially ones that have sort of walked away from faith. Many of them, they walked away precisely because, at least this would be their story, precisely because there was an objection or there was a problem or an argument, and they just didn't know where to go with it. They couldn't seem to answer it. So it was the logic that led them away. But here we're asking this question of like, but how does your worldview explain logic? Right? The very thing you used to walk away, maybe what you've walked away from is what actually explains logic. I mean, that's why I do think it's powerful, but just trying to be honest here too, that I do think that people dismiss it more for some reason. They think it's, I'm not sure why, but the moral argument seems to be that one that hits people in the gut more.
Yeah. One thing, just in kind of piggybacking on what you said, is you mentioned Lewis and how Lewis didn't typically do very robust arguments, but he always had these very pithy, powerful ways of putting things. So, Brian, one of the ways that I have found the argument from reason to get somebody thinking about it without having to bring out necessarily a syllogism right away is kind of quoting Lewis, because he does have a couple ways that he explains it that I think it doesn't express exactly what Travis is arguing, but I'm interested to hear what Travis will think of it. And I think this is a good way to kind of start to wrap up. So God in the Dock, Lewis says this. He says, if the solar system was brought about by an accidental collision, then the appearance of organic life on this planet was also an accident, and the whole evolution of man was an accident too. If so, then all our thought processes are mere accidents, the accidental byproduct of the movement of atoms. And this holds for the materialists and astronomers, as well as for anyone else's. But if their thoughts are merely accidental byproducts, why should we believe them to be true? I see no reason for believing that one accident should be able to give a correct account for all the other accidents. And so I think that's kind of a pithy way of expressing on the naturalistic view, or the view that God doesn't exist. It kind of undercuts our very ability to reason. And then, of course, we could introduce the theistic explanation and show how it is superior. What do you guys think of that?
Well, I like it because, I mean, people are familiar with C.S. Lewis and paints a great picture. It's a good lead-in for that, yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it gets down to the worldview issues that are really relevant.
Mhm.
So it's kind of that idea that, you know, there's a kind of smuggling in oftentimes in sort of a atheistic worldview, some very Christian looking or at least theistic looking things.
Yeah.
And so you have logic there, and that person oftentimes holds to something like objective morality and so on. And again, I'm not saying, I think sometimes apologists have gone too strong to say like the only way, you know, if there's morality, then there's God. I think that's too quick. But what I find far more fruitful and productive is just to ask, like, so how do you explain moral facts? Like, how do you explain something like a logical fact or whatever? And then it's the important task to say, okay, but be careful denying these things, right? And then because again, I wouldn't suggest denying morality, and I definitely wouldn't suggest denying logic. And then if we can't deny them, what are we left with? What sort of view? And again, I just think there's a sort of trajectory towards that where, at the end of the day, that's why I say, you know, I always start this way in my philosophy classes. I always say the reason why I love and revere philosophy is because at the end of the day, I really do think it all points to God. So when, you know, Plato has his cave where you're sort of, you know, through philosophy scraping your way out of the cave, and you get out and you see the forms or whatever, I say yes, all the way to the extent that once you're scraping your way out of the cave, you get out and you realize God. There's God who's been waiting for us the whole time. Because I really do think for every philosophical question, the end of it is God. Like, I think the best explanation, the best answer to that question is God.
Yeah, that's good. Well, Travis, I know that if people want to learn more about the argument from reason, they can pick up your book, Logic in the Way of Jesus. But what else would listeners be interested in your work? Where else can they learn more about you and get your great materials?
Well, I appreciate that. I have a few books that are out there. The most recent called Wandering Toward God, Finding Faith Amid Doubts and Big Questions. And we have a podcast on that one as well, and with you guys. And so, but my website's kind of the one-stop shop. So that's travisdickinson.com. You can get all my stuff, and I do offer a free book there. So if you sign up for my newsletter, you can download a free book, and my first book called Everyday Apologetics. And I do about once a month, you know, sometimes not too careful about that, but it's intended to be a once a month newsletter where I send out 3 thoughts, one of which is that I'm thinking about. Second is one that I've written about. And then the third one is somebody else's thought, a quote of somebody. So
excellent.
Well, very good. Thanks for joining us again, Travis. It's been a great time, and we'll see you again next time.
All right. Always a blast, guys. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If you have a question you'd like us to address or just a message for us, feedback, good or bad, you can either email us at podcast@apologetics315.com or leave a voice message for us using SpeakPipe. Just go to speakpipe.com/apologetics315 to leave us a message. And remember, if you include a Ghostbusters quote in your question, we guarantee that we'll read it on the podcast, and we also ensure up to 50% better quality answers. Also, if you've enjoyed today's podcast, please leave a review in iTunes or the podcast platform of your choice, and please share this episode with a friend if you found it useful. Remember, you can find lots of apologetics resources at apologetics315.com, along with show notes for today's episode. Find Chad's apologetic stuff over at Truthbomb Apologetics. That's truthbomb.blogspot.com. This has been Brian Oughton and Chad Gross for the Apologetics 315 podcast, and thanks for listening.